All right, we are back here at Microsoft Ignite NZ. I got to say it right. We're here with a special guest to talk about all things OSS. And as you recall, I will let you know that please, if you have any questions, submit them so we can answer them. We'd love to get to your questions before anything else. All right, my friend, tell us who you are and what you do.
Hey everyone, my name is Ken Thompson. So I'm an Azure Technical Specialist at Microsoft, focusing on open source, look after Australia and New Zealand.
So what does an Azure Technical Specialist do? I mean, this might be the first time anyone's ever heard of this position at Microsoft. What do you do?
So basically, I help customers and partners deploy open source software on Azure, but more importantly, focusing on delivering their outcomes that they're after.
So what does that look like? When someone has an outcome, is it just like a project? Is it like a specific program? How would you describe an outcome?
Right, so customers looking to deliver a new service to their end customers or maybe to internal, and they're looking to use open source technology to achieve that. So I help them out, anything from Linux virtual machines to Azure Container Service, Docker, open source continuous integration tooling, Jenkins, Puppet Chef, all those kind of technologies.
So that's awesome. So let's go through, let's pretend that the person watching is a CIO and they're like, hey, we have this open source thing and we want to move it to the cloud. Why don't you go through the process of what it's like to go from the on-prem OSS to full cloud OSS? What are some of the gotchas? What are some things that people need to look out for? And I want you to be as detailed as possible.
Okay. So if we're just looking at typical migrating Linux machines, virtual machines, some things you'll need to think about. Ideally use some images from the marketplace, but if you want to bring your own image, you need to ensure that you've got Linux integration services. So they're basically the Hyper-V drivers, same drivers that you'll have in your VMs. Usually they're shipped in most Linux kernels, so you don't have to worry about that for the majority of use cases. You also need the Microsoft Azure agent. So that allows us to spin up the machine, do administrative functions. And then you really need to export your virtual machine as a VHD, make sure you've got DHCP set up, and you can import it to your blob storage and away you go.
Let me see if I understand, because I'm like a devy type guy. I like programming, I do programming type stuff. You mentioned there's virtual machines running on your premises that you're trying to sort of lift and shift into the cloud.
Yeah.
It might be sort of a lamp stack, for example.
Yeah.
What you're saying is that you don't have to change too much about what you have there. You have to install, I heard two things.
Yeah.
Why don't you describe what those two things are a little bit more in detail so that we can get a sense for what they are?
Sure. So Linux integration services is effectively Hyper-V drivers. So same drivers, same services you use on Hyper-V on-premise that you use in Azure. So it's network drivers, storage drivers. It's allowing your operating system to interact with the virtual hardware in Hyper-V or Azure. The second thing is the Azure agent, and that's really allowing us, when we add an additional hard disk, to integrate that at the OS level and perform some OS level functions. It also enables us to execute virtual machine extensions. So we can do things like password reset, we can install Docker for you, we can install Chef for you, a bunch of functionality that we can then automate with the power of Azure.
So the first thing you mentioned, what was the name of it again?
Linux integration services.
Linux integration services is a way for sort of the hardware to sort of work with this VM. And so that's just sort of a hardware thing.
Yeah, and it's shipped in most latest kernels.
Got it.
So if you're running a latest distribution of RHEL or Ubuntu, CentOS, usually don't have to worry about it.
And this is just so that that virtual machine will work in all, because a virtual machine is like a little tiny machine working in a real hardware, and that sort of helps it sort of know how to work with that hardware. That's
exactly.
And then the second thing was the Azure integration services.
So the Azure agent.
Azure agent,
yeah.
Perfect.
Same agent that you'll need. You need that on a Windows machine as well in Azure. So we just got a Linux version. Obviously all open source, they're on GitHub. You can go and check them out in detail.
And that's so that Azure itself is able to sort of configure this VM or to add particular things to the VM. And so in essence, one is at the bottom of the stack and one is at the top of the stack.
Exactly.
And it enables you to sort of work with your virtual machine that way.
Yeah, exactly.
And so if you have something already built in RHEL, for example, you just install those two things, save that virtual machine, upload it to Blob, and attach it. And you're good.
Yeah, exactly. Good to go.
Is
So that's the most basic form if you want to migrate your existing stack as is.
There's got to be more though. Let's just say you want to do more than work with virtual machines, because that's sort of infrastructure as a service.
Yep.
Is there a platform as a service type thing also that you can use in Azure? Why don't you tell us about that?
Yeah, so we've got Azure App Service. So on that we have web apps. We don't only support .NET. We also support things like PHP and Java. We also have Azure App Service on Linux in public preview. We've got it in public preview. So that actually, previously we ran PHP or Java on Windows IIS effectively, and we automate all that for you, so you just have to worry about pushing your code. We do that again now, but we provide Linux as an optional base.
That's awesome. So now, when I'm doing app service and I'm doing my Node app, or does Node work on there too?
Yeah.
So PHP, let's say I'm doing PHP because we know for sure. I could just do an app service, do a Git deploy directly to Azure App Service, and it's running on Linux as an app service. Yeah, and then it's full PaaS, so you just have to worry about your code. Don't worry about your infrastructure. We manage all that for you. We manage all the patching. We manage the scaling, HA redundancy. So that's kind of where you want to get to. You just worry about your application and your business use case. What other services are available for those that are usually traditionally open source stuff? Yeah,
so definitely the popular thing in industry, not only open source now, also in Windows, is Docker.
Of course.
So we've got Azure Container Service. With that, we orchestrate the deployment of a full Docker stack. So we have the virtual machines, and then we have the Docker orchestration layer. So we provide choices like Docker Swarm and Mesosphere DCOS. We automate that for you. Spins up in like between 2 to 10 minutes, depending on how big you want to deploy it.
Sure.
Yeah, and that'll deploy a full HA stack of these orchestration technologies, which are typically not very straightforward to install. You've got to install your infrastructure, and then you've got to bootstrap different things and do a configuration, and we just make that really easy for you so you can start pushing Docker images to that platform.
For those that are an open source stack but aren't using containerization, why don't you explain sort of the benefits of containerization and the complexities? Because I don't think people understand sort of what Mesosphere does for them, and they don't understand like having it as a service, what that does for them. So let's start with containerization and the complexity that is involved with that.
Sure. So I guess containers at a high level, you have your OS layer, you have your application dependencies, so this might be your Java or PHP runtime, and then you have your actual application code. Typically in a virtual machine, we deploy the OS, and then you have to deploy your dependencies manually, and then your application. In a container, we basically wrap up the application and its dependencies into a unit, which we call a container. And then the only shared interface between the container and the OS is really the kernel, so the Linux kernel in Linux. And having that containerization really stops it worked on my laptop, it worked in test, worked in dev kind of thing, because the common problem you find between shipping code between environments was that there was a disconnect between the OS version, and it was PHP version 5.2 and not 5.3. So containerizing that really provides a little bit more power to the developer and a little bit more confidence to operations around shipping code between environments. So that's containers in a nutshell.
That's the nice thing about containers, but tell me about how it's a pain in the rear, because there's some huge challenges with containerization. Why don't you tell us the pain point, because I want people to understand. Look, we don't understand how good something is until we understand the pain point that it solves. Why don't you tell us the pain point with containers?
Sure. So when you spit up a container on one host, spins up really quick because we're not loading the operating system, which is really great. But when you talk about scaling out containers across a cluster, they have to have networking between each other. They have to be able to discover each other. So when we're talking about hyperscale containers, we're talking about running a scale-out application with hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of nodes, and they can be stopping or starting all the time. So a big problem is service discovery. When a container comes up, the rest of the containers need to know about it in order to communicate with it. So that's like networking. Service discovery is one big challenge. Another big challenge is storage. So being able to if you want to have shared storage, you spin up your application, but you want to access your customer data, how are you going to mount that on these hundreds of thousands of hosts? So that's where an orchestration platform like Swarm or Mesosphere comes in and provides that automation layer across that's going to take care of those things for you.
So distributed systems are hard. Effectively, and I don't know if you've heard this, if you have a problem in computer science and you use distributed systems to solve it, now you have two problems, right? So tell us how the cloud helps sort of alleviate these two problems.
Yeah, so we can spin them up quickly. So definitely container service allows you to spin up the stack. We can take advantage of some of the Azure services on demand, networking, storage.
Sure.
So we can definitely plug those in.
Tell us how Mesosphere is sort of integrated with all of these things on Azure, because when you're using Mesosphere in Azure, it knows about all the Azure services, doesn't it? Or how does it work? Maybe you can tell me more about that.
Yeah.
I don't know enough.
So there's a couple of ways you can set it up. Effectively, so one of the beautiful things about Azure Container Service is a full open source stack, bottom to top. It's the exact same stack you can deploy on-premise.
I see.
Right. So you can take advantage of some of the Azure services though, but by default, some of those aren't enabled. It's very easy to turn them on. Mesosphere, for example, has a universe. So when you spin up your Mesosphere environment, you go in, and it's got effectively a marketplace within your environment to add additional services and plugins. So that's where you can start adding some of those plugins and integration to Azure. So plugins to things like Jenkins. You might have Jenkins spun up on Azure and integrate that.
That's amazing. And so now as a service, and I'm not quite sure how much time we have left, but I want to get sort of to the end of this. So Mesosphere sort of is native inside of Azure. It's not a changed version of Mesosphere, right?
Nope. It's the exact same distribution you can run on premise. So that's the beautiful thing about it is you can have a full hybrid cloud. And ironically, that's one of our differentiators with our container stack on Azure is it's open source.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
So we have about 15 minutes left, and I want to take this time to sort of take us through, maybe don't tell us names, but I want to hear about sort of an experience, customer experience of migration. What were some of the things, and I want like a concrete example, because someone might be thinking, whoa, I should get rid of my servers and go full cloud, and it looks like I only have PHP, or I'm doing some kind of Java application. Tell us about how they would go about planning, migrating, and sort of operationalizing this transition into the cloud.
Yeah. So specifically around containers or just cloud in general?
Just cloud in general.
Just cloud in general. Okay. So I think some of the things you need to think about are dependencies on your enterprise systems is probably the biggest gotcha.
Sure.
So you'll have an application stack, but you've got to think about the surrounding services like identity, storage, networking, security. So when you're moving to a cloud platform like Azure, really ensure that you've got the fundamentals laid down. So make sure you have the hybrid networking available. So ExpressRoute for Azure, make sure you're looking at that, especially if you need a high-speed link between on-premise and your cloud apps, because you're not going to go to cloud straight away. There'll be a migration path, and you might always have workloads in both environments. So networks are really important. Identity as well. Ensure that you have access to identity solutions, so leverage services like Azure AD. So they're kind of the foundational elements. When you're actually looking to migrate your workload, my recommendation, a lot of customers and partners are really looking at a PaaS first policy. So on-premise, we had to run, we had to install the OS, we had to install the database, right. We had to install the application, we had teams that looked after that. In the cloud, we can get a lot of these capabilities as a service. So we can get SQL as a service, Azure Container Service. A lot of these offerings are managed for us. And you don't need to have that complexity of managing that platform. So definitely look at leveraging those components where you can.
That's awesome. And so I want to hear about sort of experiences that you've had migrating people. Obviously, I don't want you to tell me names or companies, but you work in New Zealand and Australia.
Yep.
Tell me a little bit about sort of the types of companies that have been moving to the cloud and what the experience has been like.
Yeah, sure. So I kind of work across everything. definitely some experiences with large telcos, government, also working with a lot of ISVs and startups. So I guess experience is moving to the cloud. I think if you've got those fundamentals out of the way, maybe one of the bigger challenges is the cultural aspect, right? So you did have these database teams or these networking teams on premise. Really smart guys, they deliver a lot of value, but we also automate a lot of that in the cloud. So it's about helping customers take advantage of the services, and then these guys are smart guys. Focus them on improving the application.
Got it.
So cloud gives you a lot more agility, flexibility. So probably the biggest highlight for a lot of customers is whether you're lift and shifting or you're rebuilding or you're re-architecting. Once you're there, you've got a lot of flexibility and agility to start trying things with new services, engaging your customers in different ways.
So let's talk about that cultural change, because I think when it comes to technology, the hardest part is sort of cultural shifts. Mm-hmm. What are some of the challenges that you've seen culturally, and how have these things been mitigated and solved?
Yeah, probably the biggest change is it's not how we do things or how we did things, right? We've got a way that we've got a fairly defined process, and I think a lot of that has come from traditional IT, processes like ITIL that have kind of enforced a slow rate of change. It's all about safety and consistency. So I think a lot about that is helping teams to understand that we can use things like infrastructure as code to we've gone from the days where we test and check things to now we're enforcing those in policies. So we're enforcing consistency via compliance. So I think taking customers on that journey is probably the big one.
And because it's a cultural change, mm-hmm. and sometimes cultural change is tough. Let's talk about some successes that you've seen. Have people been surprised at the speed at which these things can be done? What are some successes?
Yeah. So customers I work with, been blown away. You go, and this is applying, cloud technology and DevOps kind of practices, and they've gone from 3 to 6 month release cycles of their project down to releasing code into production at the end of a sprint, so a 2-week sprint. So now they're going to production a lot quicker, and there's actually a Microsoft internal guy, I forget the name off the top of my head, but he talks about 1/3 of your code, when you ship it to production, 1/3 of your code delivers positive value to your customers, 1/3 of your code delivers 0 value to your customers, 1/3 of your code delivers negative value to your customers. So when you start thinking about I only ship code to production 3 to 6 months, that's another 6 months before you fix those negative bugs or the 0 impact. So when you bring that deployment cycle down to 2 weeks, it's pretty empowering for the business, also the technology teams that are delivering that.
That's amazing. So a lot of people have had some success. The migration period, how long can people expect to be working on this sort of migration?
How long is a piece of string? Look,
What an awesome, but on average, it's got to be like, hey, if I have my PHP application that we've built, right, or my Java struts application. Do people even use struts anymore? I don't know. My Java application. There's going to be some timing that's going to happen. Should you plan for 3 to 6 months, a couple of weeks? I mean, what would you say?
Yeah, so if you've got a typical enterprise, monolith or not a monolith application, I probably target a 3 to 6 months, maybe 12 months if you're a lot bigger and you've got a lot of dependencies on other teams, because that can slow you down. Dependencies on teams you can't control. But if you got like a website or a WordPress or marketing site, you can have that up and running on web apps in like hours. You literally take your code and spin it up, right? So power of cloud.
So to finish up, and we have a little bit of time here, tell us the coolest thing you've worked on.
The coolest thing I've worked on. Okay. Doing a lot of cool stuff with Azure Container Service with customers. Probably the coolest thing in the pipeline at the moment is looking at some blockchain projects, so quite interesting applications of blockchain. So blockchain is is a distributed ledger. It's quite popular in financial services industries, but interesting use cases in government and agriculture and applying to IoT devices using blockchain and that distributed ledger function and really leveraging the smart transaction. So they're using it for asset management and the ability to for one party to sell an asset to another. You can kind of get away with having these current formal processes between regulatory bodies to move the official ownership of that asset, and it's almost fully automated and trusted when you put blockchain in the process. So they're the cool things.
Yeah, and I just recently heard about sort of the blockchain sort of way of having a distributed ledger that's always consistent irrespective of where it is.
Yeah.
And so now you're able to sort of track things in a lot better way. So I'm pretty excited about that. All right, so for those that are on open source, that are considering Azure, call to action, resources, what can they do to sort of get started with this transition?
Yeah, so probably 3 things. First is, if you're not using Azure, sign up. You can get a free trial. I think you get $200 credit to start playing around with Azure. Second thing would be jump on Microsoft Virtual Academy. So mba.microsoft.com. You can get a whole bunch of free on-demand courses in quite detail for some of the services we talked about. And third, hit up the docs. We've got pretty good documentation, especially we've got, if you go to documentation, compute, virtual machines, Linux, we've got a really extensive subsection for Linux virtual machines in the Azure documentation, which goes down into quite descriptive detail for specific use cases. So we talked about how do you take a Linux virtual machine to Azure.
Sure.
We have how do you take a Linux machine from Hyper-V to Azure, or from KVM to Azure, or from Zen to Azure. So very detailed steps to help you get started.
That's awesome. Well, you have been super helpful for helping people that are doing OSS. Before we go, though, we have a couple of cool things coming up. We have customizing Windows 10 image creation tips and tricks coming up in a couple of minutes. And then we have the awesome Donovan Brown talking about none other than DevOps, something that you started to talk about. Thanks so much for watching. Stay tuned for the next session, which should be coming up in a couple of minutes. See you around the break.